There are moments in life when the line between existence and oblivion becomes so thin that you don't even realize you've crossed it. And yet, somehow, you're still here, not by accident, not by mere chance, but because something, whether it's your awareness, your hesitation, or even your suffering, intervened at precisely the right moment. Think about what it means to dodge death. It's not always dramatic. It's not always visible. Sometimes it's a decision you almost made, a place you almost went, a person you almost trusted. And in retrospect, when you look back with clarity, it becomes disturbingly evident just how close you were to something irreversible. That realization isn't just shocking. It's transformative, if you're willing to confront it. Now imagine the absurdity of the world around you. People so convinced of narratives, so quick to assume outcomes, that they metaphorically write your ending before your story has even reached its turning point. Fly high, they say, as if you were already gone, as if your struggle had concluded. But you're still here, breathing, watching, learning, carrying the weight of something they never understood in the first place. And that raises a serious question. How many times have you underestimated the significance of your own survival? Because every narrow escape carries information. It tells you something about your environment, your decisions, your vulnerabilities. And if you ignore that, if you brush it off as luck, you forfeit the opportunity to become stronger, more precise, more aware. Survival isn't just about continuing to exist. It's about waking up to the fact that you almost didn't. And that realization demands responsibility. It demands that you stop moving blindly through your life and start paying attention to the patterns that are trying, again and again, to teach you something vital. You were closer to destruction than you're willing to admit. And the reason you resist that realization is because it destabilizes the comfortable narrative you've constructed about your own competence and control. It's far easier to believe that you're navigating life with precision, that you understand the consequences of your actions, that you are, in some meaningful sense, in charge. But that assumption begins to fracture the moment you seriously examine how narrow the margin was between where you are now and where you could have been. Because the truth is, the distance between order and chaos is not vast. It's razor thin. It's a moment of inattention, a decision made in haste, a failure to recognize a pattern that has been repeating itself right in front of you. And what's unsettling is that most of the time, you only recognize that proximity in retrospect. You look back and you see it, the missed signal, the ignored intuition, the subtle indication that something wasn't quite right, and you realize that things could have unfolded very differently. And that realization is not something people readily accept, because it carries with it a weight of responsibility. If you admit how close you were to destruction, then you also have to admit that you are not as invulnerable as you pretend to be. You have to confront the fact that your perception is limited, that your judgment can fail, and that the world is filled with variables that do not care about your intentions or your plans. There's also something deeply unsettling about the idea that other people, or even circumstances themselves, can miscalculate your trajectory so completely that they assume your downfall is inevitable. It's almost as if the narrative of your collapse is written externally, projected onto you by a world that does not fully understand the complexity of your situation. And yet, despite that, you persist. Not because the world acknowledged your resilience, but because something within you, or perhaps something you did not even consciously recognize, prevented the final step into chaos. But persistence alone is not enough, because if you simply survive without extracting meaning from the experience, then you are setting yourself up to repeat the same sequence of events. And that's the real danger. Not the initial proximity to destruction, but the failure to learn from it. The failure to analyze your own behavior, your environment, the people you allowed into your life, and the decisions you justified despite the warning signs. It's not comfortable to do that kind of analysis. It requires a level of honesty that most people avoid, because it forces you to confront aspects of yourself that are easier to ignore. The impulsiveness, the denial, the tendency to rationalize poor decisions in the moment just to maintain psychological stability. But those are precisely the elements that bring you closer and closer to the edge without you even realizing it. And so, when you say you dodged something catastrophic, you have to be very careful with that language, because it implies randomness, as if it just happened. But more often than not, it's the result of a complex interaction between your actions, your awareness, and the structure of reality itself. And if you reduce that to luck, you strip away your ability to understand it, to learn from it, and ultimately to ensure that the next time you approach that same edge, you don't come quite as close. Near-death moments are not luck, and to reduce them to mere chance is to misunderstand the structure of reality in a way that leaves you vulnerable to repeating the very conditions that brought you there. Because what appears on the surface as randomness is often the consequence of patterns. Patterns in your behavior, in your perception, in the environments you choose to place yourself in, and in the signals you either recognize or ignore. It's tempting to say, I just got lucky, because that absolves you of the responsibility to look deeper. It allows you to move forward without confronting the uncomfortable truth that something in your approach to life was insufficiently calibrated. But that perspective is precisely what keeps people trapped in cycles of chaos, because it blinds them to the information embedded within those critical moments. When you come close to something catastrophic, there are always indicators leading up to it. They may not be obvious at the time, and they may not present themselves in a way that demands your attention, but they are there nonetheless. A subtle hesitation, a contradiction that you dismissed, a feeling that something wasn't aligned, which you overrode in favor of convenience or impulse. These are not insignificant details. They are fragments of a larger pattern that, if understood, could have altered your trajectory entirely. The problem is that human beings have an extraordinary capacity to ignore what they don't want to see. You filter reality through your assumptions, your desires, and your need for stability. And in doing so, you often eliminate precisely the information that would have protected you. So when the outcome doesn't fully collapse into disaster, when you escape at the last possible moment, you interpret that as luck, rather than as a partial failure of perception that just didn't reach its worst possible conclusion. But that interpretation is dangerous because it prevents you from updating your internal model of the world. If you believe that your survival was arbitrary, then you don't change anything. You don't refine your decision-making, you don't become more attentive, and you don't take responsibility for the role you played in approaching that edge in the first place. And that means the same variables remain in place, waiting to produce a similar, or worse, outcome in the future. There's also a deeper layer to this, which is the relationship between awareness and responsibility. Because once you recognize that these moments are not random, you are faced with the necessity of becoming more conscious of how you operate. You have to start asking yourself difficult questions. Why did I ignore that signal? Why did I justify that decision? What part of me was willing to trade long-term stability for short-term comfort? And those questions are not easy to answer, because they often reveal inconsistencies in your character. They expose the gap between who you believe you are and how you actually behave under pressure. But that gap is precisely where growth occurs, if you are willing to confront it directly instead of retreating into the safety of convenient explanations. To treat near, catastrophic experiences as mere luck is to remain passive in the face of reality. It's to assume that outcomes are disconnected from your actions, that you are simply moving through a world governed by randomness rather than by patterns that you are capable of understanding and responding to. And that assumption strips you of agency because it positions you as a spectator rather than a participant in your own life. But if you shift your perspective, even slightly, you begin to see those moments differently, not as accidents, but as warnings, not as isolated incidents, but as signals pointing towards something that requires your attention. And once you start to interpret them that way, you can no longer afford to ignore them because they are no longer meaningless events. They are information, and information, if properly understood, is the difference between repeated chaos and deliberate order. The world misjudges your story because it never sees your internal battles, and that misjudgment is not only inevitable, it's built into the very structure of how human beings perceive one another. People don't have access to your thoughts, your doubts, your moments of hesitation, or the silent conflicts that take place beneath the surface of your behavior. They see outcomes. They see fragments. They construct simplified narratives based on limited data, and then they treat those narratives as if they are complete. And that's where the distortion begins. Because your life, from the inside, is not a sequence of clear, linear decisions. It's a complex interplay of competing motivations, unresolved fears, learned patterns, and the constant negotiation between who you are and who you're trying to become. But none of that is visible externally. What's visible is the result. The action you took, the path you chose, the moment you either advanced or fell short. And from that narrow window, people draw conclusions that often fail to capture the depth of what actually occurred. There's something particularly dangerous about that, because if you're not careful, you begin to internalize those external interpretations. You start to see yourself through the lens of others' incomplete understanding. You begin to believe that your struggles are insignificant because they are not acknowledged, or that your resilience is ordinary because it is not recognized. And in doing so, you disconnect from the reality of your own experience. But the internal battles are where the real transformation takes place. They are where you confront the parts of yourself that are disorganized, impulsive, or afraid. They are where you wrestle with decisions that carry consequences you cannot fully predict. And more often than not, those battles are fought in silence, without validation, without recognition, and without any guarantee that your efforts will lead to a visible reward. That silence can be misleading. It can make it seem as though nothing significant is happening, as though your progress is negligible. But that's only because the metrics you're using are external, and the most important changes occur internally long before they manifest in a way that others can perceive. The discipline you develop, the awareness you cultivate, the ability to pause and reconsider rather than react impulsively. These are not immediately visible, but they fundamentally alter the trajectory of your life. Meanwhile, the world continues to operate on its simplified narratives. It labels, categorizes, and judges based on what it can observe, which is only ever a fraction of the total picture. And that creates a persistent tension between your lived experience and the way it is interpreted by others. You know what it took to get through a particular moment. The restraint, the analysis, the decision to act or not act. But from the outside, it might appear trivial or even accidental. And that disconnect can either weaken you or strengthen you, depending on how you respond to it. If you rely on external validation to confirm the significance of your struggles, you will always be at the mercy of incomplete perspectives. But if you develop the capacity to recognize the weight of your own internal efforts, you begin to operate independently of that misjudgment. You start to measure your progress not by how it is perceived, but by how it aligns with the standards you are consciously trying to uphold. Because ultimately, the responsibility lies with you to understand your own story in its full complexity, not to distort it in your favor, but to see it clearly, to acknowledge both your failures and your efforts without reducing them to simplistic explanations. And that clarity becomes a form of stability, something that grounds you even when the external narrative fails to reflect what is actually happening beneath the surface. Every escape carries a lesson you are responsible for understanding, and the weight of that responsibility is far greater than most people are willing to accept. Because it's one thing to survive something difficult, to walk away from a situation that could have ended far worse, but it's an entirely different matter to extract meaning from it in a way that actually alters your future behavior. And that second part, that's where the real challenge lies. When something goes wrong, or nearly goes wrong, your first instinct is often relief. You made it through. The worst didn't happen. And that sense of relief can be so overwhelming that it overshadows the need for reflection. You move on too quickly, eager to return to a state of normalcy, to distance yourself from the discomfort of what almost occurred. But in doing so, you bypass the very process that could prevent you from encountering the same situation again. Because every close call is structured. It's not a random event that emerges out of nothing. It's the result of a sequence, choices, perceptions, reactions that build upon one another until you find yourself at the edge of something potentially catastrophic. And if you don't take the time to analyze that sequence, to break it down into its components, then you are essentially choosing ignorance over understanding. And ignorance, in this context, is not harmless. It's a form of vulnerability. Because what you fail to understand, you cannot correct. And what you cannot correct, you are bound to repeat, often with greater consequences. So the responsibility isn't just to recognize that you escaped something. It's to ask why you were in that position to begin with. That question is uncomfortable because it shifts the focus inward. It forces you to examine your own role in the situation rather than attributing it entirely to external factors. It requires you to confront the possibility that your judgment was flawed, that your awareness was insufficient, or that you ignored signals that, in hindsight, seem obvious. And that's not an easy thing to admit, because it challenges your sense of competence. But that's precisely why it's necessary. Because without that level of honesty, there is no meaningful adjustment. You might tell yourself that you'll be more careful next time. But without a clear understanding of what went wrong, that intention remains vague and ineffective. It doesn't translate into specific changes in behavior, and so it doesn't significantly reduce the likelihood of a similar outcome. There's also a deeper aspect to this, which is the development of awareness. The more you analyze these moments, the more you begin to recognize patterns, not just in your environment, but in yourself. You start to see how you respond under pressure, how you justify decisions in real time, how you balance risk and reward, often without fully realizing it. And that awareness becomes a tool, something you can apply proactively rather than retrospectively. But that only happens if you take the responsibility seriously. If you treat each escape as something meaningful, something that demands your attention, rather than something you can dismiss once the immediate danger has passed. because the lesson is there, whether you choose to engage with it or not. The difference is that if you engage with it, you gain something: clarity, precision, a better understanding of how to navigate complexity. And if you don't, then the situation remains unresolved at a deeper level. The surface has changed. You survived, you moved on. But the underlying structure is still intact, waiting to produce a similar outcome under slightly different circumstances. And that's the real risk, not the initial event, but the failure to transform in response to it.